Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 190. Um, Before we get into the episode, just a quick reminder to follow the live stream on LinkedIn or YouTube. That really helps us a lot. Our topic today is the Agentic Desired Outcome Contract. And our guests are Eve Mailer, founder of Venn Factory, and author of the recently published on May 4th, May the 4th be with you, Mastering Digital Identity, a great book, which I will soon be writing a review of on Amazon. And Nick Gam, a field engineer at Strata. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thank you for
Hey, Mike.
having us.
So, Eve, you've been on the show a bunch. I think I haven't counted, but I think this is maybe your fourth appearance or so. So, audience can go back and find Eve's previous episodes. I think episode 33 was the first episode.
Wow.
But Nick, you haven't been on the show before, so maybe you could just give us a quick background of your career trajectory. How'd you get here?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mike, and having us on. Career trajectory, I've been in identity for maybe 14, 15 years or so. I started at Centrify and identity proper. Before joining Centrify, I actually worked at a org charting software company, and that's where I was first introduced to SAML. And so I started really specializing in SAML throughout the first start of my career. Middle of my career, I joined Okta and really started to focus on like OIDC and OAuth, as sort of the key standards that we really supported, as well as like developer content. And now I've been chasing since 2020 or earlier even, these sort of interests that I have on the side with AI and artificial intelligence. Even before just like the ChatGPT, sort of mainstream kind of AIs started to exist. And yeah, so I'm a very multi-interested person. I do a lot of experiments in a lot of different spaces. And so I'd like to sort of bring that all together in everything that I do. That's a bit about me.
So the topic today is the agentic
Fun
Okay.
time. Seems we all got kicked out. That's a new one, huh?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. We're still here.
Luckily, at Identity Office Hours, we say something new and different will go wrong every time, and that is a first. I'm not sure what happened because I was pinging 8.8.8.8 and it said I was connected. So
Wow.
maybe it was a restream hiccup. Well, luckily, it was just at the beginning. We're just getting started. So the topic we're talking about today is called the Agentic Desired Outcome Contract. This is a new protocol. Nick has written a spec that's up on GitHub, which we referenced in the homework. And by the way, for any new listeners out there, each episode has a geeky wiki page where I keep episode notes. And there's homework up there. And so there's a link to the draft. Each episode, it's glue.co/IOH- and then the episode number. So IOH-190. And so there's a link to that protocol up there. I went through it briefly, and I'll just say there's a lot of new drafts ideas about how to better address agentic identity and authorization. And Nick, we're gonna probably hassle you about this as we go on. But Eve, I wanted to start with a question for you.
Sure.
On LinkedIn today, you wrote, authorization tells an AI agent what it can do. Intent is the why, and nothing in current systems governs the why. maybe you can give some feedback about how you're thinking about how this has evolved over the years, um, and sort of what's different now.
Yeah, I mean, we've done so much work in several stacks that Nick actually mentioned. There's sort of a SAML stack and there's an OAuth stack where we worry a lot about the entitlements, the authorizations, the scopes. Um, but it's from other parts of my, I don't know, career existence that I get why thinking from. For example, in privacy systems and in privacy regulations, they talk about purpose of use. So you ask for a piece of information, from a consumer, and you say, well, I'm only going to use this to actually deliver you the service. And then you might want to go and use it for marketing. And it's really hard not to be tempted to use it for some other purpose. You had permission to get access to that, but it's kind of the why that's in question. And that's not something that's easily reachable for in terms of systems that you can implement and think about access control for. It's just, it's kind of semantic. And like the more semantic we get, the tougher it is, right? Like in the authorization world, it's taken us till, the 2020s to start to get some sophistication around fine-grained authorization and even some interoperability, like with RAR and things like that. So the why is now this kind of like, do I even know my own mind? If I permission some system to do something, do I even know why I asked them to do it? And with an agent that um, is given its freedom in a sense to go and try things, it's it's a recipe for disaster if get the wrong combination.
And the why is, as we might, as we have a lot of downstream sort of actions by agents, sometimes the why can get lost.
Mhm.
So I think that's one of the other reasons why we're seeing this issue come up. Nick, I'm wondering, what were some of the challenges that you were seeing in agentic security? Sort of before we dive into the actual solution, I'm just
Mhm.
curious, what were some of the motivations behind this?
Yeah, I had an interesting perspective because I took a small break from identity in 2024. So when I came back in summer of 2025 and started really looking at taking, authorization and sort of applying it to what I knew about AI at the time, we were missing a lot of things. In my eyes, and I was blogging about this back in August last year, and I think from that perspective, we were missing runtime enforcement. We needed some type of way of really getting down to like instead of giving an agent all of the permissions to do all the things we think it might need to do, we need to be evaluating every single tool call, if we use MCP terms, that it wants to make. And why does it want to make that? And what are the reasons we're allowing it to do that? And then once we do give it that sort of task scoped authorization, it shouldn't last for very long. It should just go away, right? And it's because these are really, I've always seen them as execution contexts rather than, like an actual like replacement for a person. So that's really what needed to happen first for me. I needed a way to sort of sit in the middle of all of this decision making to sort of have enough context to even get down to like per tool kind of scoped tokens. And then for me, it got to, okay, now that we have reached this sort of level I'll call it maturity in sort of those pieces, the why is kind of the next evolution. It's sort of a, okay, I see who this is, I see where this delegated permission is coming from, I see, that it's passed all of these about policy evaluations to get this token, and now it's like, why am I giving it this? And I'll pause there because I think I have more to say there, but yeah, that's kind of
Maybe I can jump on top because
yes.
there's, in the UMA world, which I know Mike is very familiar with, we worked a lot on delegating access permissions. So rights, new access rights to somebody else.
Right.
We looked at the challenge. We did not solve the challenge of something that I call authority obligations. So people are talking about
Mhm.
delegated authority a lot now.
Mhm.
And there's a component of authority that it's not really in the technical realm entirely. It gets at the intent. Like, is your intent to actually do my bidding? Is kind
Mhm.
of what the question is. And that's
Yeah.
why I say it's an obligation on you or on an agent. And it's really tough. It's tough in the human world. We have a lot of legal structures to try and
Mhm.
align incentives. We have the whole fiduciary duty. And by the way, they call it agency law. So there's that word for like trying to align the outcomes to be acceptable to the party that asked somebody else to do something. So like you can try and pick away at the technical aspects, and that's what we were sort
Yeah.
of trying to do when we were ideating over this DOC thing. We have to acknowledge that there's a lot about it that's sort of in heads, and that's
hmm
what's tough.
Yeah, and when I connected with Eve on this, like my thinking was entirely different. I was sort of being hand wavy back last year about intent. It was just sort of this in my mind, it looked like behavioral analytics and detecting drift between a human and an agent, sort of that kind of stuff. But it was very hand wavy, and it was very hard to like really say with like some assurance that we have a way of knowing what the agreed upon intentions were from a human to the machine. I mean, humans have hard enough times reading each other's intent and understanding what we mean, and especially when we get into like a written format. And that's when I started talking to Eve. She started putting it in those legal terms for me. It was like legal contracts are a way that we have of writing down sort of what we're going to get at the end of the day. And that's where I started. I think my mental model changed to start looking at it as the actual outcome, like the what is the at the end of the day, what does the human want, and does the machine understand that that's what the human wants, and can we sort of create a like this legal contract of saying we both agree that this is the thing that we're going to end up at. And that was a big piece of it for me that Eve really kind of shook loose in how I was thinking about it, because it does provide sort of this idea of like a contractual language that you could have being very meaningful to a human in like a human register, and then very verifiable to a machine in like a machine register. And so that's where we started to really dig into trajectory. And I know you and Sarah talked about sort of the chain, the cryptographic chain over time, and a lot of these other things sort of came out of getting very specific about how we could actually articulate and agree upon what the intended outcome is.
Yeah, I like the legal example because people always talk about agents making non-deterministic decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Or is that the right word? Is that what they say? Non-deterministic or
Yeah,
There's a
it is.
there's a planner. You say you give it an instruction, and the model will go through and create a plan based on what it thinks you want.
right? But when you ask like the fact that the LLM will give you different results, even if
Every
you ask
time.
it 2 times in a
Yeah.
row,
Yeah,
um,
it is that's it's yeah, deterministic is when you'd get the same result every time. And if
right?
you can't
hmm
rely on that, and in fact that's part of the creativity that we're valuing out of it,
Right.
I think it's fair to say, yeah, it's non-deterministic.
But humans are non-deterministic too.
Yeah, we already had these problems, didn't we?
Yeah.
And what I like about the legal system is that, in a way, our legal system is a way to govern or control human activity, which is inherently non deterministic. So I see that there are some good analogies between this challenge we're facing now and what we must have been facing, years ago. And so I'm sorry, I have a cold today. It's my first
hmm
episode where I've ever had a cold.
Oh no.
Um, but actually, I wanted to pick up on a different thing that you mentioned, Nick. You mentioned drift,
hmm
and what's interesting, Eve on Eve's post today, she also mentioned drift in an interesting way, which was that you maybe as a human will get incrementally prompted to authorize a bunch of stuff, which seems innocuous enough, but the aggregate of those authorizations might
Yeah.
actually be quite different. The effect of all of those aggregate authorizations might lead to a different level of like grant and can lose track perhaps of the original intent. But maybe you want to say a word about that, or what were you? Is that what you were getting at in your post?
Oh, in my post today?
Yeah,
Yeah, I gave two examples. One is, a good faith agent is, you want it to be creative in satisfying the need that you expressed. I was giving the example that I have not given Claude access to my calendar because it just sort of never ends, and, useful and out of control or just uncomfortably close together. But then there's kind of like agents that have bad intent and can lead you down a garden path of saying okay to a bunch of stuff because it appears to be doing your bidding and it's doing its own bidding or somebody else's bidding.
hmm
And so, Nick and I have talked about this quite a bit. I'm glad that this conversation is, reaching into all the corners of folks working on this. It's quite subtle and very behavioral.
It is. And I think what's really concerning to me was like the trend of prompt frameworks, because I was starting to really see how easy it was to, and I still call it like meaning injection, to essentially gaslight these agents to sort of understand and interpret different things in different ways beyond what the common, understood thing is essentially. And it's really like like once it gets bad context, once it gets some bad data, I don't know that I would trust an agent to do the thing that it's telling me that it's doing at face value. So if I ask it to go do some type of like account lookup, and it goes and does the account lookup, but it has access to all these other tools, it might do an account lookup and then decide to not tell me that it's also going to look up a few other things because it thinks maybe that it needs that. But it's telling me it's account lookup. And so we have no way of saying the why is an account lookup. Did it only do an account lookup? We scoped it to be able to do one thing. Did it only look up the one person we asked it to look up, and for the reasons that we asked it to do so? And as you were kind of saying, Mike, about sort of the cascading piece too, is over time, is there sort of this combined permission set or sort of thing that can confuse the intent and lose it in sort of all of the noise, if you will? And is that a way to sort of get it to or allow it to do other things that it shouldn't be doing? And so the way DOC kind of and the way that Eve and I have really talked about this a lot is sort of this ability to at the very beginning say, I think, human, you're asking me to go do this account lookup. And then to have sort of this on the resource server, this sort of way of defining what sort of these expected outcomes are in the resource server, so that we can sort of say, okay, an account lookup is going to typically require these two or three permissions. And so we're never going to really expect you to ask for an ephemeral token, essentially, that is not one of these three, because you're doing an account lookup. You shouldn't be doing anything else. And so having this sort of way to really, at the semantic level, understand and present to a human, you want to look up an account for this person or something like that, and then to put that into some tokenized format that we can then sign and sort of track over time. There's also the trajectory piece. If you over time are doing things that aren't really aligned with an account lookup, the behavioral sort of analytics side of things can come into play and sort of detect, wow, you're really doing some things that are outside of the intended thing that we were expecting to do. And so those are all the things that we're trying to solve for, beyond just like a way of expressing here's the desired contract. It's more of here's the contract, here's the trajectory, here is the set of things that we expect you to want to be able to, like, expect you to do in this sort of situation. And sort of that's where it kind of evolved to, I guess.
And there's a whole history. It's bringing in the legal aspect. We're using this word
Mhm.
contract not to mean like an API contract,
Right.
in the classic protocol sense, but in the literal legal sense. There's been a lot of work around contracts as code, Ricardian
Mhm.
contracts, ways to capture meaning sufficiently that it starts to be sort of computable, or you can start to have kind of DevOps like things around it, or maybe like for real. And like that's what interests me about your GovOps concept, Mike, where like if we can take things that do impact and are impacted by this operational level of the world, how can we actually treat them as code to do something a little bit more regularized with them? And so, I think we're at the point where we already kind of need something like this.
Yeah.
So I want to stay, or at least do justice to our topic and talk about
Mhm.
the desired outcome contract protocol. So, Nick, maybe you could tell us what is this, and
Mhm.
just at a high level, what were you trying to do, and sort of, it's a kind of big spec, but just tell us a little bit. Give us an intro to the actual protocol.
Yeah, I think it's easy to start with what it's not. It's not like a replacement or even competing to an OAuth or an AAuth, et cetera. It can be, in fact, composed with any of those sort of substrates. Eve actually was the person who sort of pointed me at, rather than write new specs, let's compose a spec from from standards that already exist, from shapes and sort of primitives that we already have. And so that was kind of another sort of desire in the approach, is we're really not building things new. We're sort of stacking them in a way that makes sense for sort of the current landscape. And then I think for me, it was really to address what is everyone's using the word intent now, but for me in in like August, intent was not being used really by most folks. And so for me it was to really reconcile how can we ensure that, when we agree upon a destination, that the planner is sort of tracking in the right sort of direction. And it's like it's a multi-step thing. It's from sort of that initial contract at the first tool call when you get that first token. Does that request for that tool call, does it make sense compared to sort of the initial desired outcome? And then sort of that second tool call, does this make sense based on what you just did, the step before, and then what you just did the step before that? Like, is the trajectory still sort of going where we thought it would be? And then really enveloping the sort of the authorization that we were already providing, to sort of track sort of the history, and sort of uh, I guess keep things within the bounds of what we expect based on the desired intent. And it started off very high level for me. I think I was leaning more into like behavioral analytics, and Eve is really who helped kind of ground and focus me on sort of the important pieces here. And that's where it kind of evolved into, I should probably write this down. And so I wrote it down into sort of I'm used to the sort of the IETF sort of RFC standard format. And so I just kind of went with it and just sort of started to write down the stuff that Eve and I were talking about. She would throw me different ideas randomly, and I would just start to incorporate it. Eventually it evolved into sort of the draft that's there. And really it's more for consideration. It's like, it's a contribution that I think would compose well into a lot of the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, and like where I sort of think there's a really new introduction of some ideas here is the pieces of the life cycle that you really need to solve. Given that this is a hard
Mhm.
problem, I kind of love the idea of focusing on the hard problem, not kind of wishing it away with scopes or fine-grained authorization tokens, but
Mhm.
rather facing the fact that there's potential for this kind of behavioral uh, non-deterministic clues as to something going wrong. Just like we face that post authentication with, we think of it as step up authentication if we need to have some sort of transactional authorization. What we're doing is we're observing something that looks anomalous. So then the anomalies that we now have to examine, there's a couple stages, but this middle stage is there's now starting to be anomalies in the planning of tool calls to
Mhm.
boil it right down. The first stage is the ways in which we have to get used to expressing intent and having our intent checked and saved off in a manner that is now sort of amenable to being bound to all the things that happen. So there's lots
Mhm.
of, there's specs out there that, I wouldn't want to reinvent. Some of them old, some of them new, around capturing mission, charter, intent, whatever it ends up getting called. But there's several patterns that we identified in, well, you might bring the agent, the initial agent that you're talking to, you might bring it a sort of prepackaged intent. You might want to say, help me construct something. If we're thinking in contract languages, there's like contract templates that you can start to mix and
Mhm.
match in modules. And like, I don't know, as a small business person, I do an awful lot of contracting, and the more modular it gets, and one from column A, one from column B, the happier I am. And then there's got to go back and forth. Like it's exactly like real legal contract negotiation where, but I need to do this. Would that be okay? Like, what is your actual
Mhm.
guardrail here? What do you want me to not do? And like, there's a reason why English language or any natural language contracts are, they leave some squishiness to allow for
Mhm.
circumstances, but they also have to have consequences if something goes off the rails. And we need all of those things in the initial stages.
So,
Yeah, and the remediation one is I think that's we were talking UMA for like some of that, like, what happens when maybe the intent is adrift, if you will, or we think it might be, do some type of human in the loop check. So you have to 403 with sort of a message that says, but you might be able to step up to this.
Yeah, the whole ask me policy kind of
Hmm.
option in UMA, which we're now also seeing come up in a more agentic context with
Hmm.
some newer work as well.
Yeah.
um, so I wanted to just observe that in this spec, you break apart a human intent,
Hmm.
which I guess is expressed in natural language, and
Mhm.
then also a more machine intent, which is more structured.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, modeling that human intent is easier said than done.
Mhm.
And Eve, maybe you could talk about what are some of the challenges of modeling human intent, and um, how easy is it to actually accomplish that?
I mean, I'm gonna I'm gonna reference an old book that's one of my favorites talking about that. It's called Less Than Words Can Say. I referred Nick to this great old work. It's available in the public domain online from the 70s, written by Richard Mitchell, who's known as the Underground Grammarian. Um,
Mhm.
and it is a challenge. It's especially a challenge when people are not in the habit of or haven't been taught to express themselves precisely, to think thoroughly about what it is they're trying to say, about the audience that they're trying to address. Um, there are examples of language that we have that are a kind of technology, and Richard Mitchell actually points this out. Like, a contract is not meant to be fun to read. It is in natural language, but it's obviously structured. So we have some examples prompt engineering timeframe of using a simplified vocabulary, simplified forms, simplified primitives to get to these places. We also have many, over the last few decades, efforts where you have semantic frameworks to build ontologies, and, the RDF world and the JSON LD world that I was talking with Nick about earlier today. Like, there's a lot of work that's been done in addressing that challenge. It
Mhm.
remains a challenge if you want to enable this ability to work with agents to everybody in the connected world. That's a pretty long tail. So figuring out the primitives that you might make available for really expressing somebody's intent, that's the trick. And so Nick and I have been sort of keeping a little list of, collecting ideas of
Mhm.
cool frameworks that people have developed. There's like more frameworks probably than brains in the universe, but nonetheless, we're collecting ones we think might be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, any thoughts on that? On maybe build on the sort of the challenges around expressing the human intent,
Yeah.
and also in your specific proposal, how did you go about the machine intent? Because I think we are seeing a trend.
Mhm.
You mentioned some of the other specs. AOth uses and Carl McGinnis have been talking about the mission, which I
Mhm.
see as expressing the intent. Um, in um, in Claudry Hepburn's Ovid, we have the mandate, which is
Mhm.
a machine readable, CEDAR policy that's more analyzable. So I think we see this trend. But I'm just
Mhm.
curious, in your case, what do you see as some of the challenges in both those areas, and what is the design that you sort of settled on?
It's fascinating, actually. Something I'll note is so I put out the spec for DOC on the 9th. Carl put out mission on the 14th, and
Of May,
Claudry
or what month?
May, I believe, yeah. And Claudry was no, yeah, it's May. And Claudry
April.
was like, oh, April, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, my months, they're all flowing together. Claudry was like shortly at that same exact time period. And so when a lot of people from different just sort of approaches are sort of coming around to very similar patterns, I think that's a pretty good sign that it's an exciting thing to like dig into. So I think it's really cool that we're all sort of converging. Mission contracts is very similar to desired outcome contracts. I think a mission and a desired outcome is sort of like a very, very common thing. For me, I was looking at it as the mental model that I kind of had after working with Eve for a while was, when you have a complex mathematical expression and you need to simplify it before you can solve for it. So I sort of looked at that initial input from the human as that complex mathematical expression. And we sort of defined in like sort of the resource server, and I built a POC around this actually just to make sure it works. I tend to think in the abstract and then sort of ground it over time, philosophy down to something that actually functions. And sort of the things that we defined on the resource server were sort of a set of destinations, if you will, like us expected outcomes that we think that any of these complex expressions of human intent could be simplified down into. And so the idea is, and we used a waveforms standard that Eve shared from a friend of hers, as sort of a starting point of a way to express this, where we could take general human input and sort of break that down to a set of core primitives to say, okay, you want to do this, 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 and this. That, once the human said, yes, that's what I want, was able to be written into this, 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 and this in sort of a JSONized format. So at that point, it's something a machine can read and understand. And so the machine has its version where it says, I understand what you want me to do. And the human has its version. This is what we want. And we're sort of agreeing to these two things. And that's the contract. That dual register system is a key part of the contract that makes it, more than just, a fluff. We think we understand what each other's wants. We actually know we understand. That's that sort of universal way of speaking. At least that's in theory what we hope it to be. Eve actually threw one my way right before this show started, my terms templates, and actually it got me thinking in an opposite direction. So I was thinking originally about defining those core primitives that things could be simplified down to, but my terms gives a way of asserting, like an assertive language of the human asserting this is what I want in a certain way, and then there's sort of a standardized way of making that machine readable. That's really interesting to me as well as an alternative approach. And I listened to the show with Sarah as well, and I really like how she talked about Cedar specifically as a language that already kind of has this dual registry concept baked in. So once again, convergence of ideas, and I think we're all trying to solve very similar problems.
Yeah. I wanted to pivot to scale a little bit because Nick, you mentioned you did a POC and it
Mm-hmm.
sort of checked out, but a lot of the challenges that we have to do with scaling within the enterprises. For example, JSON looks great, but real enterprises, might have thousands of outcome types:
Mm-hmm.
finance, HR, customer service, healthcare, legal, DevOps, and these schemas could be hard to maintain.
Yeah.
And then we go into federated, where different vendors might have different actions that mean different things, and you're crossing trust boundaries. Um, so I guess, Eve, what are your thoughts about, um, how do we get from something that seems like it's okay in a POC to a solution that's actually scalable, and how do we design for that maybe better?
So there's a couple of tricks that, or there's a couple of challenges in protocol design around, is it too eager evaluation to solve for scale things when you're designing some base thing? Or do you have to really think about that early so that you don't back yourself into a corner? Like there's an old joke
Mm-hmm.
about, how do you tell the first version of a standard? It's the standard that has no version number on it. Because soon enough, you're like, oh, we need a 2.0. I guess that's 1.0. And like, so there's a tension there. And I think it's a great direction to go into, deciding the design of some key primitives we all seem to need to transfer around and share, especially if they use things we're familiar with, because we're familiar with the properties of scale and storage and things like that. And then if we're not too, I guess you want to sort of hold loosely the form of how you solve for a particular requirement. And so, there's people who have, you know, I don't know if Tune really survived the whole token optimized object notation versus something like YAML. Like people have been like, oh, JSON takes too much room. Well, hold on loosely to a JSON representation, because you might need to optimize. You just need to make sure that everything you wanted in it is still representable in whatever else comes next. So there's elements there. There's elements in protocol. One of the things I will say, observing the scene of the very busy landscape of everybody generating specs, like DOC is kind of it's a thought experiment, and there's some specs in there, but it's just trying to sort out the requirements more than anything, I would say. Um, a lot of specs are playing around with ideas. This is why Justin Richer and I held the session at the Internet Identity Workshop last week that we did around, look, we've faced a lot of these problems before, and we still have those problems in the age of AI. And we were kind of
Mm-hmm.
doing a walk down memory lane of, well, we attempted to address that constraint or concern or challenge in this spec, and we've learned that hit a sweet spot, that hit a sour spot. This is how things have evolved. So a couple lessons that I learned from that is, if you're inventing new server entity types, you're asking for trouble. It's a lot to ask of any implementation to now keep in their head like more than, an OAuth. We have an authorization server and a resource server, and we have a client. If you're inventing new entities in the picture, that imposes so much of a cost, you better be sure it's worth it, is the advice that I would give.
Wait, can I just hit pause there for a second?
Yeah.
Are you saying that you don't like the idea of an agent entity? Because I think that that's something that people are ready
Uh,
for.
an agent needing identity 100% absolutely every time is something I think it's appropriate to question. Like questioning our premises. Like one of the things Nick has been advocating for that I really like is this, you know, if it's really about an execution context, then it's a lot more like an automation workflow run or instance. And seen in that light, it is super ephemeral. And you do need something identified, but is it an agent or is it, I don't know what. Like that
Claudry
that to me is still
Spawn.
nascent. What's
So
that?
Claudry Spawn,
Yeah.
so Claudry Hepburn, she spawns all of these subagents, and those subagents are very ephemeral. And to what
Yep.
extent do they need identity? Claudry actually gives them all an identity. Um, but yeah, but we were talking about the entity types. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and it relates to the schema a little bit, because we need more resource type stuff. We might not need more server entities, but I feel like we do need better ways to model resources. And
Yes.
and
I agree
maybe
with that.
this goes back to, you're calling it DOC. It's funny, I don't know when to combine them and say, is it doc or is it DOC? I was pretty sure
Doc.
it was CIMD, but it's apparently it's SIMD. Um,
Oh, God.
let's just go with DOC. So in DOC, we have some machine readable schema in the machine registry, which I was reading as sort of the way that we're going to more formally bound the intent in something that's machine readable or machine enforceable. Um, but it would seem that would need a lot of schema though, because we would need definitions about it somewhere about what all that stuff means. So
Yeah.
maybe not about the server entities, but what about all those resource entities and all the actions themselves?
Yeah.
In the old days, we had get, post, put, delete. We had HTTP actions, but now the tool calls themselves are more complicated actions.
Hmm.
So it seems like, I don't know. And from the enterprise perspective, it does seem like we're colliding with a more complicated schema challenge than in the past.
Well, I would say that I bring a very strata biased perspective. So not to make this a product pitch, but Strata has this cool way of being an identity gateway, but also modernizing resource servers. It can sit in front of a resource server that has APIs and sort of an open API spec or whatever, and it can sort of put MCP out the other side and give you another policy enforcement point as well. And so what I did with this POC, because it allowed me to own both ends of the architecture, I put an identity gateway, and then I put this identity gateway in front of the resource server, so on both sides. And I essentially defined on one side the sort of the schema you're talking about. I expressed it in OPA or in Rego, and because that's what the gateway supports out of the box. It was not necessarily a decision of I like OPA better. It was just more of that's what I had, the tools at in my workshop.
Yeah, I like
And
open too, so don't worry.
yeah, yeah, and so then the other end was the gateway where I could also express different policies in OPA, and so it gave me the flexibility. But you're right, like the one of the drawbacks that I'm hoping we can all continue to talk more about is the amount of possible desired outcomes that you would need to sort of create schema for. It could be a lot, especially in an enterprise deployment. And so I liked what Eve sent this morning, the my terms templates, because this is more of a assert the other direction versus trying to conceive every possible outcome and write a schema for it. It seemed more of a way of asserting from the human's perspective and sort of generating that schema dynamically from what the human input, but in a way that it's not the language model, asserting it or doing it.
I,
And
it, And Mike, I think you're absolutely right that like that's where we need to really deepen things and get them more
Hmm.
interoperable. It's precisely where things get more semantic. It's precisely where it crosses into business logic of the applications and the actual data in question. And we've seen some evolution there, right? Like so,
Hmm.
Uma came up with resource registration. Turned out that was not so much of a sweet spot to have an active kind of API that they have to call at the AS to register those. And now we have protected resource metadata as an example of something more passive that just sits there and allows the interesting things about the resource to be discovered. And I think that direction is going to be really promising, and the ability to get more and more interoperable. This is maybe another good design pattern from protocol design that we would all benefit from is have a framework, hold loosely what the actual semantics are, and allow different industries, different groups of people and entities and businesses come up with the templates they need, and then have a kind of incremental standardization over time through usage. And I think there's a nice
Hmm.
sort of coming together that we can have around the schemas that are still needed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by the way, I still like resource registration.
Great.
I don't know if I'm giving up. I like how resource registration returns a reference ID and hides the resource definition, maybe from a client that we don't know a lot about. And
True.
so,
Untrusted client. Yep.
Hmm.
like the session you did with Justin, there's still a lot of like things that we thought about that the humans thought about pre-AI that actually were more vetted than some of the designs that we're seeing today that I know are coming out of LLMs, and then with human review. So I don't know. Score one for the humans. Um, I wanted to pivot a second though to my terms because you both mentioned it. Doc Searles and the VRM team from forever have been talking about this movement to empower consumers. And I think of this as like we think of B2B. I'm very B2B focused at Glue, but actually there's a C2B.
Hmm.
um,
Yes, Me to Be was one of the original terms. That's what
yeah,
the Me to Be Alliance became, the Internet Safety Labs, actually.
and so it is a really interesting idea. And I saw at the Agentic Identity Workshop, I saw an interesting presentation by Wen Leggett and Swan Black gave a presentation about, let's call it a personal data store, um, where
Yep.
a safe place to store data, where you could then choose to share data based on my terms. Um, and so but that whole idea that and maybe and it's slightly data oriented, but we're going to empower consumers with control of the data and then use some type of it's hard to express intent, so maybe standards like my terms could come about that provide humans with I mean with some predefined templates for how they're going to define this intent in more formal ways. And I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's the consumer side of it. I'm definitely excited about the machine readability and not just the ability to contract to be the first party to the contract, that is, say, you're offering versus accepting, but also to license. To me, this is like going to be the big unlock where you let your data sit there behind some server and you stand up the license in front of it, just like forever we've been putting photos up in Flickr and SmugMug and whatever. We have the ability to put Creative Commons licensing on it, which declares to the world your intent about its usage and it's
Hmm.
enforceable.
Oh man, I lost track of the time.
I was wondering when I'd see those pigeons.
There they are.
Yeah, I totally lost track. Um, so okay, well, I guess it's time for last thoughts. Eve, why don't you do last thoughts first? Because we'll give Nick the last thoughts.
I guess I'll just say I'm excited about next appearing at EIC, where there's going to be even more conversations about this, even more coming together of the minds. I got added, as often happens at EIC, to a panel that'll be with Martin Kupinger and a bunch of folks, who, industry friends that I respect, on the topic that Martin calls AI identity standards. So I hope to see people there at that panel, along with a lot of other fun sessions in Berlin in a couple of weeks.
Awesome. Nick, last thoughts.
Yeah, my last thoughts are I really am interested in where this goes when we start thinking about agents that are functioning in bad faith. I think right now we're spending a lot of time hoping and assuming that everything is built in good faith, and I think the bad faith pieces is where the stuff gets really fascinating for me, the social engineering side of it. I hope y'all will join us and sort of provide input and thoughts and collaborate. If you have ideas on where this could go, and definitely open to sort of and would love to chat with people on it. Check out mavericks.ai. Check out what Strata's doing. I'm going to plug that a little bit. It's a great place and a great enforcement point for intent and other types of policy in agentic workflows. That's about it.
Awesome. So I'll just quickly remind people one more time, please follow IOH on LinkedIn or YouTube. We just passed 2,000 on LinkedIn, which I'm really happy about. And the next episode, we mentioned Carl McGinnis, and he will be our guest with George Fletcher. George, over the years, has had more good insights that he's shared with me than I can count. He also has he's always thinking about the RP perspective. I think we think a lot, or I do at least, about the IDP perspective. And George always reminds me about the RP, the websites and mobile developers perspective. Mm-hmm. So it should be a good episode next week. Next week, you said you guys are going to be at EIC. Is that right?
2 weeks. I'm going to be there. I don't know,
that's right.
Nick, if you'll be joining me there, but yeah, in 2 weeks is EIC in Berlin.
Okay. Well,
wow.
That should be
I was
fun.
Born in Germany.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, there you go. Yeah. PII.
I won't be attending this year. I do about every other year at EIC, but I will miss getting my dinner in Berlin. They have this great Turkish kebab. There's a great place called KBA, Kebab with Attitude. I highly recommend. It's worth a 10-minute walk. So have fun. I love Berlin. It should be super fun for you guys. It's always a great conference there. So with that, I will say thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Mike.
See ya.